Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Facebook Live session on tackling biases in critical developmental stages of childhood. We are blessed to be here today with Nicole Vignola. She is a neuroscientist and a brain performance coach. And I came across her Instagram and really just connected to her work. And especially for me as an educator and a consultant who focuses on issues of equity, I'm always just trying to tie in brain science, and more importantly, how we as adults can really rewire our brains from negative thoughts about ourselves and about others. Because I truly believe that a lot of those negative thoughts about ourselves, and biases that we have towards others impact our relationships. And it also, I think, influences the way we interpret experiences that we come across. So before we get to rewiring of our brain, if we can first talk about how these biases towards other groups of people start, and this might be a two-part question. And is it the same way that we develop negative messages about ourselves? For example, things like I'm dumb or I'm not worthy, nobody likes me. Are those kind of the same way in the brain?
Yes, yeah. So, we learn through observational knowledge. We learn through what our parents are doing, what our parents are saying. When we're children, we learn from our environment. So, everything that shapes us is coming from somatosensory input. So, for example, when you're growing up, you grow up and you see the world. There's sensory input coming in, and then your brain develops a response to that.
Mhm.
Now, that observational knowledge can be a wonderful thing because you can learn how to get to school without your parents having to tell you how to get to school because you've been doing it for so long. But
Mm.
that also means that you pick up on nuances, especially children, and they have really sort of brains are like sponges, they absorb everything, right? So the way that parents are talking to each other, to themselves, and they might not even realize it, but that's shaping the way that they then perceive the world. And there's also these sort of unspoken nuances to the way that children behave as well, in the sense that they can pick up on how parents feel about themselves, even though they might not necessarily be saying particular things about themselves. But children, they're quite intuitive. You can pick up on these things, and I think to some level we can all resonate with that. You grow up and you have this thought or this belief system that you don't really understand where it comes from, but you know that it stems from somewhere. And I think to some extent, we're all kind of undoing what our parents have either taught us to some extent, or what society has taught us. If we live in disadvantaged areas, we might be picking up on different things and racial biases, neurodivergencies. We're now told, we're put in these boxes, so we learn that we belong in this box, and this is what this box does, and this is what we have to do for the rest of our lives.
Mm.
So to answer your question, yes, I guess that the question was, how do we learn, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, through observational knowledge, through our parents, but also through repetition. So
Mm.
you believe this idea, and then it gets so deeply ingrained that it shapes then the rest of the way that you see the world. So now you're going through life with this label. Let's assume that maybe you have a neurodivergency and you've been labeled a particular way. Parents can teach their children that this could be a good thing. And I think that we are hopefully stepping away from the bias that
Mm.
the neurodivergency is bad, and I put that in inverted commas. But you could also very easily be you know categorized in this box that means that you have a disability. So then you go through life being ostracized, or pushed away from societal norms. You don't fit in classrooms, you don't fit around your friends because you
Mm.
have this thing, you see. So it's unfortunately something that we do pick up as children, but hopefully it's something that definitely can change. But I would like to say that hopefully something that is changing in
Mm.
the way that we are approaching the world. I'd like to believe that we're sort of part of a generation that is more educated around these biases and topics, and hopefully we can step away from putting people in categories. But
Absolutely. And can you, just for the audience who are not educators, can you clarify what neurodivergencies are?
So neurodivergency is essentially anything that's not neurotypical. So somebody who might suffer with a learning, I don't like calling them a disability, but maybe a learning difference, autism, ADHD. Oh, there's so many, but anything that's not neurotypical, if you will. And to some extent, I'd like to argue, who is neurotypical? Don't we all have our own
Right.
little quirks in some ways, But we've all been put in this box that says we have to operate in a certain way, regardless of how you learn or how you think.
Yeah.
So
And it's
that's
very,
neurotypical.
yeah. And it's very systemic too.
Yes,
Um,
100.
perpetuated. There's, yeah, so many systems.
Yeah.
So thank you for answering that. So then it leads to the next question for children and just for adults too. Is it the same way? Can we rewire our brains the same way, from biases towards other, but also these internalized negative messages that we say to ourselves?
Yeah, you can. And I've actually got a couple of clients who I'm working on that with at the moment. And the wonderful thing about the brain is that it can be rewired with enough attention and intention. We can change pretty much anyway, obviously up until a certain extent. The key in that department is knowledge, understanding that that can be changed. I think there's a lot of people, and also up until recently, we didn't realize how plastic the brain was. We didn't know that we could change so much.
Mm,
So again, it goes back to me believing and hoping that I think we're part of a generation that's able to educate people and say, you've been brought up in this box, but you don't have to be in this box. I think we can see from the world, we have access to social media. We can see that you can pretty much, to some extent, be whoever you want to be if
mm,
you wanted to. So I do work on that with a lot of my clients at the moment, rewiring their narratives, reshaping their thoughts, their beliefs, and that self-sabotage, that inner voice that's critic, that's, we have an area in the brain called the default mode network.
okay.
And that is essentially the area of your brain when you're mind wandering, when you're not thinking about anything. So your idling state, if you will.
Okay.
That can be upregulated in a way that makes you more creative. So people who are creative have higher connectivity in the default mode network. They are able to use their memories and siphon them and use them as inspiration, which is what sort of differentiates them from people who are more executive or have high executive function.
Mhm.
Now, that default mode network is also that area of you and your autobiographical memories, thinking about the future, thinking about the past, thinking about your friends, thinking about yourself. And it can be upregulated in a way that makes you ruminate more. That means you have more negative self-referential information. But that pattern can be broken. It can, and I'm doing it with clients at the moment, which is amazing. So there is hope. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, I was told, and just from my own very superficial levels of reading, I am not a neuroscientist. I say that all the time, but I was told that once you catch yourself saying things about yourself or other groups of people, to immediately follow it up so that you create new neural pathways, that will eventually, hopefully, override that first initial negative thought. And is that
Yeah.
correct?
Yes. So we have a negativity bias as humans, right? We focus on the negative. We actually have, out of the 8 basic emotions, 5 of them or 6 of them, I believe, are actually more negative. That is because of survival mode. So we've had to survive. So if you have a look at any emotion chart, you'll see that most of them are negative. So we have this bias towards, reverting to negativity. And I think that again, through observational knowledge with our parents and, the world around us, we can easily revert into these patterns. So it takes quite a lot of effort to become positive, or break that pattern. But yes, the way we learn is, you have a trigger, a cue, and a reward. So when I say to my clients, when they are talking negatively to themselves, what I get them to do is to use that as a trigger to then remind themselves to think something positive. Because how often have you thought of wanting to create a new habit or stop breaking that negative thought pattern, but then you forget, right?
Yeah.
That's the way that our brains work. We have to save energy for our frontal cortex, which is responsible for higher order thinking. So
Mhm.
anything that's automatic is going to be reverted back to, especially if you're tired. So when you're in
Yeah.
the negative thinking pattern, if you can catch yourself and think, oh, okay, well, I've just done that, but it's fine because now I'm going to dismantle the firing pattern by adding something else to it. And that is that I'm not going to think like this. Actually, I'm going to turn it around and think about all the good things about myself. And it's a chore, it's a task, it's hard. We haven't been taught these things at school. So
Yeah. I mean, I that's something that I've been working on, I think I want to say 5, 7 years, is just kind of rewiring the negative thoughts because they impact the way that I even tend to work that I have to do, right? So the self-sabotage creeps in and I go into like procrastination mode or I
yeah,
can't do it mode. And so it's the awareness of it that was really the first thing that I had to do was become aware of it. And then the second thing that was really hard for me was actually wanting to change it.
yeah,
I there were a lot of narratives, things like why am I so fat or I don't look cute or all of those narratives. Those were easy for me to change. But there were certain narratives that I was not ready to change. And then I had to kind of dig into that and I realized if I change that narrative, then really who am I? Because it really was the core of so much of the decisions that I made and so much of it, it really influenced a lot of the relationships that I had. So it took
yeah.
me months for me to finally say, okay, I'm ready to change that narrative. But it was
Wow.
very emotional. Yeah.
That's so profound and amazing that you can recognize that because, that's actually one of the things that I find with people is, they don't really want to change a lot of the times because it's hard. It's really hard. You've gone through life this particular way and now you have an excuse for it as well. So you can act up and just blame it on that.
Yeah.
So I find that the biggest thing about change is wanting to change. And I think that
Yeah.
was the key for you is that there was a lot of things that you had to sort of come to terms with. And,
Absolutely.
because sometimes it's nice it's like you want to self-sabotage and feel a bit, sorry for yourself. It's easier
Yeah.
to do that and it feels comforting in a way.
It was the comfort. Yeah. And for me, and I know for a lot of people, my friend Eric and I talk about all the time, people with chronic pain, this idea that if I'm not one with back pain or if I don't have chronic pain, then really who am I? Because that pain really is linked to so much of who I am and the decisions that I make. I mean, it's always a fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
Um, and so I guess within those conversations about how to rewire our brains or even how our brains are wired, what is a message that you think parents and educators need to know about it? I mean, it is, from my understanding, it's not just what you say, but it's also what you do. I know that we have mirror neurons, so we really just pick up what we see our parents doing. So when our parents are in the mirror saying like, "Oh gosh, I'm fat," or I'm, saying those things, our children pick up on it. No matter, I've heard that that's stronger than a parent saying "You are beautiful" to their child. Is that true?
Yeah.
And then how does that work, and also in classroom spaces?
Yeah, well, the mirror neurons actually turn out to be a little bit disappointing in terms of research, but it is
Okay.
true. It is true that we thought that they were related to specific neurons that actually mirrored what we were doing, but it's not. It's the same principle. Is you pick up on these things and then you learn from that. So same concept, just the mirror neurons were a little bit disappointing in the end. But
Yeah,
yeah,
good to know.
you know, it's so hard because you don't realize the impact that you have on the people around you, especially children,
Yeah.
until but then also we can't overthink it too much because then we start becoming. I mean, I don't have children, and hope that one day I will be very aware of this, but I think it's important for educators and parents to allow their children to be and to feel what they want to feel and to explore that there might be changes. And I think having these conversations and being open and allowing children to express themselves, because I think that's one of the biggest things that we struggle with as adults is we haven't been taught to express ourselves. How are you feeling right now? So then, we go into our own head and we start ruminating and worrying, and because we haven't been able to voice ourselves and how we feel. So I'd like to, encourage people to ask their children how they really are feeling, and put these conversations out on the table, because they might be little people, but they definitely are smarter than we think they are.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, 2-year-olds will tell you how they're feeling immediately, right? But I
Yeah.
do think that starts to become suppressed. The older they get, the more they realize they are not validated for their emotions, or they're shamed for their emotions.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah.
Yeah, and growing up is so hard, because children are mean, and they get bullied, and so it is really tough. But I think being able to put these conversations on the table with your parents and your educators, and really dig down into how people are feeling, is a very valuable lesson, because yeah, and explaining maybe how these thoughts work, and that we all have them, maybe sort of having some solidarity, in the sense that if they understand that we feel the same things, and that's completely normal. And the other thing I'd like to say is that we have an emotional brain, and then we have your central executive brain, so your logical brain. And when you're in that state of default mode network of ruminating, you're not really that logical, right?
Yeah.
You don't make sense when you're saying all these things to yourself. So I always get my clients to write it down on paper. Are these things real? Okay, what are you thinking? Okay, I look fat in this dress. I look like this. I am not worthy. Okay, write it down. Now you start writing it down. You think, okay, this is actually not true, because your logic brain's now kicking in. Then you can start rationalizing. Okay, is this real? Maybe it is. Okay, what can we do about it? Maybe wear a different dress. Or maybe you can't do anything about it, so then you can say, okay, actually that was my emotional brain talking to me, self-sabotage kicking in.
Mm.
you know
I've also heard another exercise, um, is to question, where did that narrative come from? So
yeah.
always going deeper into the why. So why do I ask this about myself, or why do I feel this way? Where does it come from? And you
Mm,
know, when we can, I guess, narrow it down to the awareness of, it's actually not a reality, it's something that society has put on me or said, or even the images I've been seeing images on in media. um, I think it's another way to kind of put ourselves and shift ourselves back into a reality that we're
yeah.
living in someone else's reality, honestly, that
Well,
they
that's
created for us.
exactly, because people will always have something to say about particular groups, or
Yeah.
particular, again, neurodivergencies. If people with ADHD are hyperactive, and there's these sort of labels around these boxes. So again, making sure that we can teach children to feel what they are feeling, not what society is telling them that they are feeling, because that might be wildly different. And I think, yeah, it's such a hard topic, because there's so many boxes that people love categorizing things.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mm,
And that was a great segue, because the other question I wanted to ask, you know, I wanted to spend some time talking about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive
activity.
disorder, right? Um, and one of the issues that we in America, and I don't know, I forgot to say this, audience, but Nicole's in the UK.
Yeah.
But one of the issues we have more specifically here is that ADHD is really over identified with children who are Black and Brown, because of race and cultural behaviors that are exhibited in the classroom. And a lot of educators don't even recognize that it's cultural, and they misunderstand their behaviors as just being wrong and something that needs to be corrected or fixed with medication.
Yeah.
And in my experience as an educator, I've been an educator for almost 20 years, is I really have found that there are two groups of parents. One group really are those who over medicate the children, and they're just following what the doctor says or what teachers say, and they put a lot of their trust into those people. And then you have the other group that are just, no, I'm not going to put medication in my child, and who are afraid of what could happen once they start medicating the children. So I was hoping, could you speak to both groups of parents, those who are over medicating and then those who are scared to medicate?
Yeah. I guess I'll start with the over medicating. And with medication, obviously it works. And, they will, what I always like to ask though is how much of your child's personality do you
Mm,
want to medicate, Because we're putting children in a box again, and we're putting them in a classroom that says they have to operate in a particular way that might not necessarily fit the way that they want to operate, you
right.
know? And just because you have ADHD and you can't sit down in a classroom doesn't mean that you don't have other strengths, right? And we know that with children with ADHD, or people with ADHD in particular, they love doing the things that they want to do. They actually hyper focus on the things that they enjoy. So now
Mhm.
you could argue that maybe they're just in an environment that doesn't make them happy, right? So, if we could find a balance, maybe where there's a level of medication, if that's what parents want to do, but also allowing their child to explore that maybe maths isn't for them. Maybe it's creativity, or maybe it's something else. And that, maybe they just need to ride out that system until possible to then operate in a time. Because, when you grow up, you then realize that there are so many more things than just sitting in a classroom and having an ability to concentrate. My
Yeah.
partner is a successful businessman, and it does not function the way that I do. I can sit down and write papers and get to it, but he could never do that. But he's successful and he's happy. But if you put him in a classroom, he wouldn't do very well. So that's that. I hope that answers it. The parents who are too scared to medicate or don't want to medicate, it's a tricky one, and I'm not a medical doctor, so I do need to make that very clear. But there are critical developmental stages, and medication has been shown that it can, in fact, help rewire those sort of executive networks in a way that helps the children when they're older. So it might not be the worst thing to do it, especially if it's done before the critical developmental stage, at whatever stage that is. That will be sort of down to the child and the doctor, if you will, and the medication that they're on. So medication can actually help rewire the brain. But then, of course, you've got the problem where people are quickly just want to medicate because they want a solution, or they want an answer, so they don't. So it's a very, very fine line. But it can be very helpful, and they can help increase dopaminergic receptors in the brain, which is one of the sort of hypotheses for ADHD, is that there is a dopamine deficiency in the frontal cortex. So increasing that at an early stage might mean that they could then come off medication at a later stage and have developed central executive function networks.
Okay.
Now, it's complicated because we're working on population sizes, right? We are looking at individual cases, and then we're looking at samples as well. We are looking at what's happening right here and right there. We don't really have enough long-term data on what's happening to children who have been medicated sort of 10, 15 years later. There's data to show up to a year, there's data to show up to 2 years, but so it's all very complicated. But I guess if I could have it my way, I would maybe change the way that the schooling system, educates, which is what you're doing. And it's amazing, because I don't think that, I think even if nobody had ADHD, we would still all be wildly different in the way that we learn. And in fact, we are. We all, pick up on things. And I was a bad student. I was a terrible student. And I'm a neuroscientist now. I
Yeah.
nearly failed in high school because I didn't want to pay attention. I don't know if I've got ADHD. I never got diagnosed. But yeah, so
Yeah. I
it's,
agree. Yeah. Um, I, oh shoot, I just had a question that escaped my mind. Um,
we were
oh,
talking. Yeah, yeah.
we talked earlier about even just the weaning off the medication, that not everyone who takes medication for ADHD has to be on medication for the rest of their lives. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's some amazing data that's coming out recently on omega-3 supplementation in conjunction with ADHD medication and actually antidepressant medication as well.
Mm.
And they showed that they had modulatory effects in a way that they could lower the dosage on, well, this was done in people with depression actually, but they could lower the dosage of the SSRIs, of the antidepressants. And in conjunction with the omega-3s, they had the same effects. And that shows some promising data for ADHD as well. There's a lot of research going into that now at the moment. So, yes, there is scope for being able to come off medication. There is scope for being able to manage symptoms as well off medication. You know, you might get to a point where you're a bit older and you don't have to go through school anymore. So now you don't need to have, you know, medication as much medication, as you could sort of wean yourself off or lower the dosage and sort of manage the symptoms in a way that is conducive to the life you want to live.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much for saying that. And I want to be respectful of your time and the audience's time. So for the last question I want to ask to close us up is, what is something that you wish all parents, teachers, or just educators in general just knew about children and the brain? One nugget, but I know it's not the top, but just at least.
Wow, that's a
Yeah.
big question. Um, you know, the child brain is so, we have these critical developmental stages that are so, you know, wildly important. And I think I want people to teach their children and education sort of, I guess, schools to help children navigate their own brains, you know, and understand who they are, because understanding who you are in the world is probably one of the biggest, you know, problems that we have with society. Is that, again, like you said, we have, you know, these groups that tell us we need to be a certain way, but you know, if we can learn at an early age, who are we, you know,
Yeah.
regardless of what's around us, who are we when everything else is stripped away. I think
Right.
that's, you know, because the brain, you know, once you can learn that, you can learn, you know, once you can be your own best friend, I guess it's, you know,
Mm.
it's important.
I love that because when I hear my friends say negative narratives about themselves, I always say to them, "Is that something that you would say to me?"
Yeah,
And they say no, and I'm like, "Then don't say that about yourself." So I love that you said that.
yeah.
I'm gonna borrow that.
Yeah, yeah, no, go for it. Because I think, yeah, I think children, they struggle. You know, like, growing up is so hard, and you know, especially with all these labels and social media and you know, bullying. So you know, if we can learn who we are early on, and you know, I'd like to think we've really sort of um, solved half the puzzle.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicole. We dropped her Instagram at the bottom of our screen. And please feel free to visit her Instagram, which also is connected to her website. She also has a LinkedIn. And thank you so much, Nicole, for your
Thank
time.
you very much for having me, and I appreciate it. Thank
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
you. Bye.